He wore makeup, silk gowns, and jeweled crowns. He asked to be called Empress instead of Emperor. He married a man in a public ceremony and offered a reward to any doctor who could surgically turn him into a woman. And yet, he ruled the Roman Empire at just 14 years old. His name was Elagabalus, and his 4-year reign remains one of the most bizarre, scandalous, and misunderstood chapters in all of ancient history. Forget what you think you know about Roman emperors. This was no stoic statesman like Marcus Aurelius, no military genius like Julius Caesar. Elagabalus was a teenage Syrian priest who brought chaos, color, and controversy into the heart of the Roman world. When he arrived in Rome in 219 AD, he didn't come as a conquering general or noble heir. He came as a gender-fluid high priest of a foreign god, dragging with him a sacred black meteorite and an entirely new religion. In a society obsessed with order, masculinity, and tradition, Elagabalus shattered every expectation. He danced in public rituals, held daily ceremonies to honor his sun god Elagabal, and redefined the very idea of imperial power. Not through military conquest, but through identity, performance, and spectacle. To the Senate, he was a threat. To the people, a curiosity. To history, a puzzle. Was he mad? Was he brave? Or was he simply a child in a position of unimaginable power, trying to reshape an empire before it destroyed him, whatever the answer? One thing is clear, Elagabalus didn't just rule Rome, he dared to remake it in his own image. And what followed would shake the empire to its core. This is the story of the emperor who lived as no one before him dared, and who died for daring too much. Rome thought it had seen everything. Conquerors from the north, traitors from the south, philosophers from the east, barbarians from the west. But nothing could prepare it for what arrived in 219 AD, a teenage emperor from Syria, dressed in silk, worshipping a sun god no one in the forum had ever heard of, carrying not a sword, but a black meteorite. The Roman Empire had long been a sponge for foreign influences, absorbing Greek art, Egyptian religion, Persian mysticism. But it had always done so on its own terms, controlled, contained, repackaged into something recognizably Roman. Elagabalus broke that pattern. He didn't ask for Rome's approval. He didn't try to blend in. He brought the East to the West not as a visitor, but as a conqueror of culture. What unfolded during his reign wasn't just a scandal. It was a full-blown cultural insurrection. Elagabalus didn't simply worship his Syrian god Elagabal. He declared him the supreme deity, placing him above Jupiter himself. The message was unmistakable. The heart of Roman identity was no longer Latin, no longer Roman at all, but Eastern, mystical, and alien. He ordered the sacred black stone, the divine meteorite from his hometown of Emesa, to be installed in a brand new temple in the center of Rome. Senators, generals, priests, all were expected to bow before it. Daily rituals were held with music, incense, dancing, and chants in foreign tongues. To traditional Romans, it was heresy. To Elagabalus, it was destiny. But the real clash went deeper than theology. It was a war over identity, over who had the right to define Roman. Elagabalus didn't just import a god, he imported a worldview. In Syria, priests wore elaborate robes, bore makeup, and channeled both masculine and feminine energy. In Rome, masculinity meant battlefield valor, stoic restraint, and public decorum. So when the emperor showed up in drag, wearing eyeliner and perfume, and called himself a bride of his god, Roman society recoiled. The East celebrated ecstasy. The West worshipped discipline. And suddenly those two forces were living under one roof in the palace itself. The reaction was explosive. Rome's elite saw it as the beginning of the empire's moral decay. But for the masses, the emperor was a spectacle. Some were horrified, others mesmerized. Foreign embassies didn't know how to respond. Should they treat him as a priest, a king, or something in between? Even within the imperial family, the tensions boiled. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, the architect of his rise to power, began to question what she had unleashed. What had started as a political maneuver had evolved into something uncontrollable, a revolution, not of armies, but of symbols, clothing rituals, and gender roles. And that's what made Elagabalus truly dangerous. He wasn't a foreign invader with troops at the gates. He was an internal invader of culture, faith, and tradition. He corrupted nothing but exposed everything Rome had tried to suppress. He made private fears public. He embodied the empire's greatest anxieties about losing control over its identity. He showed that power wasn't just about swords or laws. It could be expressed in make-up music and belief. In the end, Elagabalus wasn't executed because he lost a war. He was eliminated because he represented one. He became a symbol of everything Rome feared it might become if it surrendered to the cultures it had once conquered. He forced an empire built on conquest to confront a terrifying possibility. What if the conqueror became the conquered from within? The story of East versus West in Elagabalus's reign is not just a footnote in Roman history. It's a warning about what happens when identity, tradition, and power collide. And like all great empires, Rome didn't fall to the barbarians at the gate. It began to crack from the inside. And this young emperor, wrapped in silk and soaked in incense, was the hammer that struck the fault line. It didn't start with a sword. It started with a whisper. In a far corner of the Roman Empire, not on the battlefield, but in the inner chambers of a Syrian villa, a group of exiled imperial women were plotting the unthinkable, the overthrow of a sitting emperor. No legions, no conquests, just a teenage boy with a pretty face, a sacred bloodline, real or fabricated, and a grandmother with the political instincts of a serpent. His name would become Elagabalus, but his rise to power was not his own. It was engineered by the most underestimated force in imperial Rome, its women. In 217 AD, the empire was in chaos. Emperor Caracalla had been assassinated by his own Praetorian prefect Macrinus, a bureaucrat with no dynastic legitimacy and even less charisma. His claim to power rested on military control, but the legions in the eastern provinces, fiercely loyal to Caracalla's memory, weren't convinced. And that's where Julia Maesa stepped in, a name most Romans had forgotten, but one that would soon bring the empire to its knees. She was Caracalla's aunt, the sister of Julia Domna, and the matriarch of a powerful Syrian bloodline. More importantly, she had two grandsons, and one of them, she claimed, was Caracalla's secret son. That boy was Elagabalus, barely 14, a high priest of the eastern sun god Elagabal, handsome, mysterious, and eerily resembling the fallen emperor. Was the story true? It didn't matter. What mattered was that soldiers believed it. Julia Maesa didn't need to fight Macrinus, she needed to out-narrate him. She spread rumors, paid bribes, staged appearances, and handed out donatives like candy at Saturnalia. In May 218 AD, at a remote legionary camp near Emesa, her plan paid off. The soldiers declared Elagabalus emperor. What followed wasn't just a coup, it was a matriarchal masterpiece of manipulation. While Rome was busy mocking women for spinning wool, Julia Maesa had spun a dynasty. She and her daughter Julia Soaemias managed everything: logistics, alliances, communications with the Eastern legions. They weren't advisors, they were commanders. And for a brief, surreal moment in Roman history, the most powerful empire on earth was being puppeteered by a trio of Syrian women. They didn't need thrones or swords. They had bloodlines, bribes, and a boy who could be molded into a god. Macrinus, caught off guard by the speed and scale of the revolt, scrambled to regain control. But it was too late. His army crumbled at the Battle of Antioch. He fled and was executed en route to Rome. And just like that, a 14-year-old priest who had never fought in a war, governed a province, or even spoken Latin, fluently became ruler of the Roman world. On paper, Elagabalus was emperor. In reality, he was the most beautiful weapon ever wielded by a grandmother. But power engineered is not the same as power controlled. As Elagabalus marched toward Rome, he began to assert himself. No longer content to play the role of divine puppet, he started making his own decisions. He replaced Mesa's advisors with his personal favorites, executed old allies of Macrinus, and slowly shifted from boy god to boy ruler. The women who made him king would soon realize they had created something volatile. He wasn't just a vessel for their ambitions, he was becoming an emperor with a vision of his own. That's the tragedy and genius of Julia Maesa's plot. She won the empire, but not the emperor. Her brilliance brought him to power, but it couldn't shape what he would do with it. In a world that denied women formal power, she rewrote the rules from the shadows. But shadows don't last in the light of absolute rule. And the boy she placed on the throne would soon cast a shadow of his own, one that even she couldn't control. It wasn't a sword or a crown that Elagabalus used to challenge the Roman world, it was a rock. Not just any rock, but a meteorite. Smooth black and polished by centuries of worship, this sacred stone wasn't a symbol of Roman glory. It was a relic from the Syrian desert, venerated as the living embodiment of the sun god Elagabal. And when the teenage emperor brought it to Rome, he didn't just carry a foreign deity into the capital. He brought a revolution that shook the foundations of Roman religion, identity, and pride. Elagabalus wasn't content with adding his god to the Roman pantheon, as so many emperors had done before him. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to replace. Jupiter, the king of the gods, the thunderbolt-throwing guardian of Roman statehood, was demoted. Mars, Venus, Apollo, all pushed aside. In their place, he elevated the solar god of Emesa, a deity so foreign that even its name felt alien to Roman ears. To the devout Romans watching their temples repurposed and their festivals overwritten, this wasn't religious tolerance. It was blasphemy in the imperial court. But to Elagabalus, this was destiny. Raised as a high priest in Emesa, the god Elagabal wasn't just his faith, it was his identity, his lineage, his claim to power. He wasn't merely Rome's emperor, he was the divine intermediary of a cosmic force. So he ordered a massive temple built on the Palatine Hill, the Elagabalium, where the sacred stone would be enthroned like a living god. Senators were expected to bow before it. State rituals were rewritten to center around it. Roman religion, once defined by balance and tradition, was now a spectacle of incense drums, chanting, and solar ecstasy. Every morning, Elagabalus would dress in priestly robes embroidered with stars and flames, crown himself with gold, and led ceremonies to his god. These weren't quiet prayers. They were performances drenched in perfume, drenched in symbolism. He danced. He sang. He paraded the black stone through the streets in a golden chariot flanked by eunuch priests and Syrian musicians. And the people of Rome, used to stoic rituals and sober sacrifice, watched in stunned silence or open disgust. To many Romans, this wasn't just foreign, it was offensive. A god without a Roman name, a temple without Roman rules, a boy priest who called himself both emperor and bride of the sun. Religious revolution had turned into cultural rebellion. And at the heart of it all stood a young man who believed he had been chosen not to serve Rome, but to transform it. Yet beneath the shock and scandal lay something even more dangerous, a challenge to the very concept of Roman control. Religion in Rome wasn't just faith, it was politics. Temples reinforced social order, Rituals defined the state. The gods were woven into the identity of the republic, the empire, the very soul of the city. By replacing them, Elagabalus wasn't just introducing a new god, he was threatening to rewrite what it meant to be Roman. His critics called it madness. Historians called it sacrilege. But modern eyes might see something else: a boy raised in a different world, trying to graft his spiritual truth onto an empire that never asked for it. Was it delusion, or was it the first attempt at religious syncretism on an imperial scale long before Constantine dreamed of a Christian empire? Elagabalus tried to center Rome around a singular cosmic deity. He failed, but the seeds were there. And in that failure lies the tragedy. He wasn't overthrown because of politics alone. He was destroyed because he dared to rewire Rome's sacred heart. Because in the end, Rome could tolerate emperors who murdered, who stole, who indulged, but not one who made them bow to a god they didn't choose. Elagabalus brought the sun to Rome. But the empire was not ready to burn. The most feared man in Rome wanted to be called Empress. He wore silk gowns that shimmered like sunlight, painted his eyes with kohl, adorned his face with rouge and gold powder, and stepped into the Senate in embroidered slippers instead of military boots. He didn't just blur the lines between masculine and feminine, he set them on fire. In a city that worshipped stoic generals, disciplined fathers, and marble gods with chiseled torsos, Elagabalus dared to live as something else entirely. Not a man, not a woman, but something the Roman world had no words for, and that terrified them. From the moment Elagabalus stepped into the imperial palace, whispers became shouts. He wasn't simply a boy emperor with strange tastes. He was a walking rebellion against the Roman ideal. Gender in ancient Rome was tightly policed, not through laws alone, but through culture, custom, and fear. Men ruled, women obeyed. Masculinity meant control, restraint, and public service. Femininity was for the domestic sphere, private, silent, invisible in politics. Elagabalus shattered that structure. With every gesture, every gown, every kiss he gave a man in public. Historical accounts, especially from Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta, seethe with outrage. They describe the emperor as dressing like a bride, referring to himself as a queen, and performing rituals in women's clothing. He married at least 5 times, but only once to a woman. The rest were men: a charioteer named Heracles, an athlete named Zodicus. These weren't secret affairs, they were state marriages, complete with ceremonies, announcements, and palace gossip. In one case, Elagabalus even called himself the wife of Rome's strongest gladiator and demanded to be addressed as lady. But perhaps the most shocking claim of all, he allegedly offered a fortune to any physician who could surgically turn him into a woman. Whether this is fact or exaggeration, it reveals something undeniable. Elagabalus didn't just break gender roles. He wanted to become something new, something sacred, something beyond the binary. And for that, the Roman elite labeled him a monster. It wasn't just the acts themselves, it was what they represented. Romans could excuse cruelty. They could tolerate excess. But this was something deeper. This was identity fluid, uncontrollable, unapologetic. And it was being displayed on the most powerful stage in the world. The emperor wasn't a symbol of the state anymore. He was a symbol of change, of danger, of everything the empire feared it might become if tradition cracked. To the people in the streets, his femininity became a spectacle. Some laughed, some were disgusted, others whispered prayers fearing divine punishment. In the Senate, older men shifted uncomfortably as they were forced to address their emperor using feminine pronouns. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, had to salute a man who dressed in veils. This wasn't just cultural discomfort. It was institutional breakdown. The identity of the emperor had always defined the identity of the empire, and now that identity was fluid, fractured, queer. But behind the scandal lay something more human. A boy. Or perhaps not a boy at all. A soul raised in a mystical Syrian tradition where gods were not always male or female, where priests could embody both creation and destruction, sun and moon, man and woman. Elagabalus wasn't pretending. He was becoming. And Rome couldn't bear to watch. This wasn't simply a crisis of morality, it was a crisis of perception. How do you govern an empire when your ruler refuses to fit any of its roles? How do you maintain order when your leader doesn't reflect the image of order itself? In the end, Rome didn't just kill Elagabalus for what he did, it killed him for what he was becoming. And buried with his body was a version of Rome that might have dared to be different. But history, like empire, is built by those who win. And in this battle of identity, the old Rome prevailed, but not without leaving behind a haunting question. What if the world had been ready for him? If Nero was decadent and Caligula was mad, then Elagabalus was something Rome had never seen, a teenager turned sun god, drowning the empire in silk perfume and confusion. His palace didn't feel like the seat of power, it felt like the backstage of a fever dream. Marble floors were covered in flower petals. Guests were served feasts of peacock tongues and ostrich brains beneath ceilings that rained down rose petals. Musicians played foreign instruments, while eunuchs danced in glittering robes. Courtiers changed costumes mid-banquet, and at the center of it all was a boy in makeup and gold presiding not like Caesar, but like a bride on her wedding night. To Elagabalus, this wasn't indulgence. It was religious ecstasy. The lines between temple and court priest and emperor performance and policy had vanished. But to Rome, it was chaos. The Senate watched in horror as serious matters of state were delayed, not because of war or plague, but because the emperor was in the middle of a 4-hour ritual to his meteorite god. Military appointments were handed out to dancers and fortune-tellers. Economic advisors were replaced by astrologers. Rome had always been decadent, but never so unserious. And that was the difference. Previous emperors may have indulged in luxury behind closed doors, but Elagabalus put it on stage. He wanted Rome to see, to witness his god, his rituals, his beauty, his power. He ruled not from the throne, but from a moving chariot that carried him and the sacred stone of Elagabal through the streets, scattering incense and scandal in equal measure. To the people, it was fascinating. To the elites, it was humiliating. The empire that had conquered the world now looked like it was being run by a boy hosting a costume party. But beneath the gold and glitter was something darker: isolation. Elagabalus had no allies, only admirers and enemies. His family, who had once pulled the strings, began stepping back in fear. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, who engineered his rise, started quietly planning his fall. Senators plotted behind curtained alcoves. Generals rolled their eyes. Even the Praetorian Guard, bribed with endless donatives, grew tired of the endless pageantry. The emperor, once a beloved puppet, had become an unpredictable force, a monarch no longer following any script. The alienation was gradual but total. As he sank deeper into his mystical identity, the empire drifted further from him. Governors in the provinces grumbled about reforms they didn't understand. Tax collectors couldn't keep up with the lavish spending. Craftsmen were conscripted to create decorations for meaningless rituals. Traders complained of delays due to religious processions that blocked city streets. Farmers whispered that the emperor cared more about a rock from Syria than Rome's starving children. In truth, Elagabalus didn't abandon Rome. Rome abandoned him. He spoke in symbols they couldn't read, prayed to gods they didn't know, loved in ways they couldn't accept, and ruled in a style they didn't recognize. The empire that once boasted its ability to absorb foreign cultures was now rejecting one of its own because this one didn't flatter their image. It challenged it. He made Rome look in the mirror, and what it saw was uncomfortable, a ruler more interested in incense than empire, in beauty than brutality, in becoming divine rather than Roman. By the time the Praetorian Guard turned on him, the outcome was inevitable. Not because he was weak, but because he was alone. Elagabalus built a palace of gold, but no one lived in it with him. His excess wasn't just luxury, it was a fortress, a barrier, a glittering perfumed wall between himself and the empire he tried to rule. He didn't just isolate the Senate, the army, the people. He isolated himself. And in doing so, Elagabalus became a symbol not just of decadence, but of what happens when a ruler stops speaking the language of their society. His life was a parade, his court a temple, his reign a spectacle. But when the music stopped, there was no one left dancing. An emperor who refuses to listen doesn't need enemies, he creates them. And by the third year of his reign, Elagabalus had stopped listening to everyone. The Senate, the army, even the family that put him on the throne. What began as spectacle had curdled into suspicion. What started as a golden boy cloaked in incense and mystery had become a monarch trapped in his own illusions. The rituals grew longer, the processions stranger, and behind the velvet curtains of his court, Rome was falling apart. Elagabalus had never been a politician in the Roman sense. He didn't speak the language of diplomacy or command the loyalty of men through shared values or battlefield victories. His power had come from spectacle, from being different, divine, dramatic. But the longer he ruled, the more that spectacle alienated those whose cooperation he needed to survive. The Senate, already uneasy with his Eastern rituals and disregard for tradition, now found themselves forced to attend daily ceremonies they could barely understand, let alone respect. The emperor demanded that senators witness fertility rites, parades of eunuchs, and sacrifices to a sun god who had never been a part of Roman law or myth. And each time they bowed out of fear or fatigue, they lost another shred of dignity. But perhaps more dangerous than senatorial resentment was military disillusionment. The Roman army had tolerated madmen before Caligula, Nero, even Commodus, but those emperors had at least pretended to respect martial tradition. Elagabalus didn't even bother. He rarely visited the frontiers. He appeared at military parades in robes, not armor. He appointed priests and lovers to command legions. To the Praetorian Guard, who had once murdered emperors for less, this was betrayal dressed in silk. Behind palace walls, paranoia took root. Elagabalus began purging advisors he believed were disloyal. He shifted power toward astrologers, mystics, and foreign priests. State business was delayed, ignored, or handed off to men who had no interest in governance. Provinces went unvisited. Local rebellions simmered. Governors wrote letters that went unanswered. Meanwhile, the emperor spent hours locked in ceremonial chambers, lost in communion with his god. The empire, vast and complex, was now ruled by a teenage priest-king who had stopped ruling altogether. Even his own family, once the architects of his rise, began to turn away. Julia Maesa, his grandmother, and the true power behind the throne, had seen this story before. She had elevated Elagabalus as a figurehead, expecting to govern from behind the scenes. But what she got was something no one could control. Not an emperor, but a force, a symbol, and now a liability. She knew what the army wanted, what the Senate feared, what the people whispered. And she began planning his replacement. But Elagabalus didn't see it coming. How could he, surrounded by flattery, incense, and illusion, he had built a palace of echoes where only his voice was ever heard? His decline wasn't dramatic, it was silent, steady, like a candle burning through its last layer of wax. The rituals grew more frantic, the punishments harsher. Anyone who questioned his behavior was exiled, imprisoned, or worse. And the more he tightened his grip, the more the empire slipped through his fingers. By the winter of 2122 AD, the writing was on the wall. Factions had formed in the guard. The Senate had begun to plot. Even palace officials, once drunk on power and proximity, now whispered about a transition. Julia Maesa had found a solution, a quieter boy, more Roman in manner, more obedient in nature. His name was Alexander Severus, and he would be everything Elagabalus was not. In the end, the emperor wasn't toppled by invaders or assassins in the night. He was hollowed out from within, isolated, ignored, and finally irrelevant. The sun god he served burned brightly, yes, but it also cast long shadows, and in those shadows, Rome prepared to erase him. He came to the camp wearing his priestly robes crowned in gold, expecting praise. Instead, he met the cold stares of men already planning his death. On March 11, 222 AD, the boy who once paraded as a god emperor walked into the lion's den, unaware that every salute, every bowed head was a lie. For 4 years, Elagabalus had ruled with incense instead of iron, spectacle instead of strategy. Now the empire would respond not with revolt, not with rebellion, but with something far colder, betrayal from within. The Praetorian Guard had once cheered him as emperor, lured by donatives and dynastic promises. But loyalty bought with gold fades quickly when honor is stained. These were soldiers raised on discipline, order, and Roman tradition. Yet here stood an emperor who danced in public, wore gowns to inspections, and appointed lovers as commanders. He had turned their barracks into temples, their rituals into mockery. To them, Elagabalus wasn't just unfit. He was an insult wrapped in perfume. Julia Maesa saw it coming. She had created this emperor, shaped his rise from whispers and bloodlines, but now she saw the structure collapsing. The Senate hated him, the people mocked him, and the military was restless. So she made a decision that defined the brutal logic of Roman power. Blood must be spilled to save the dynasty. She shifted her favor to Alexander Severus, Elagabalus's quiet, obedient cousin, and began to maneuver for a transition. The Guard was promised stability. The Senate was promised sanity, and Elagabalus was promised nothing. The final act played out at the Praetorian camp. Elagabalus arrived with his mother, Julia Soaemias, expecting to address the Guard and assert control. But what he found was silence, a deadly, loaded silence. In a scene that feels almost theatrical in its cruelty, the soldiers ignored their emperor and turned instead to Alexander, hailing him as Caesar. Elagabalus panicked. He shouted, he pleaded, he ordered. No one moved. The emperor, who had once dazzled with godlike ritual, now stood powerless before mortal men. Then came the chaos. The soldiers advanced, not as protectors, but as executioners. Elagabalus tried to flee, but the gates were already closed. Julia Soaemias clung to him, begging for mercy. There would be none. The boy who had once commanded divine worship was struck down not by foreign enemies or scheming senators, but by the very guards sworn to protect him. The emperor and his mother were butchered on the spot. No trial, no ceremony, just a swift, brutal end to a reign that had dared too much. But perhaps the most horrifying moment came after the killing. Roman tradition granted even the worst emperors a proper burial, cremation, remembrance, a place in the mausoleums of power. Elagabalus received none of it. His corpse was stripped, dragged through the streets like a criminal's, spat on by the crowd that once watched him in awe. Then, like an afterthought, His body was thrown into the Tiber River. No grave, no inscription, no legacy, at least not one Rome wanted to remember. This wasn't just murder, it was erasure. Damnatio Memoriae, the Roman sentence of memory, condemned. Statues smashed, names chiseled out, records destroyed. The emperor who tried to remake Rome in his own image was now being systematically deleted from it. Yet paradoxically, this attempt to forget only made him more unforgettable. Elagabalus became a cautionary tale, a myth, a symbol, not of weakness but of what happens when identity defies empire and empire fights back. In the end, he didn't fall in battle or succumb to illness. He was betrayed by his own blood, abandoned by his gods, and butchered by his protectors. Not because he was a tyrant, but because he was different. Too different. And in ancient Rome, difference could be deadlier than treason. They didn't just kill him, they tried to erase him from existence. Not merely from the world of the living, but from memory, from monuments, from history itself. Elagabalus, once emperor, priest, bride of the sun god, was now Rome's greatest embarrassment. His death wasn't enough. The empire needed a cleansing ritual, political, symbolic, and so began the most violent erasure Rome could offer, Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory. The black stone he worshipped as divine shipped back to Syria in silence. The temple he built on the Palatine Hill, stripped, rededicated to Jupiter, and scrubbed of every Eastern symbol. Statues of Elagabalus were toppled, their faces mutilated, nose, broken eyes, gouged names carved out. Coins bearing his likeness were melted. Inscriptions were rewritten as if he had never ruled. Rome didn't just reject him, it rewrote reality. A cultural deletion, thousands of hands working to pretend he had never worn the crown. But the violence of this erasure revealed something deeper: fear. Rome had endured mad emperors before Nero, Caligula, Commodus, and yet their names survived. Why was Elagabalus different? Because he had threatened not just Roman politics, but Roman identity. He had defied every category they used to define power: gender, religion, decorum, tradition. He ruled in gowns. He prayed in foreign tongues. He kissed men in the forum and called himself Empress. His existence forced Rome to look at parts of itself. It wanted to deny the fluidity of culture, the fragility of order, the possibility that power could come wrapped in softness and silk. And so Rome didn't just bury him. It tried to scrub the stain from its soul. His mother, Julia Soemius, was denied burial rites. His allies were purged. Even his grandmother, Julia Maesa, the woman who engineered his rise, supported the campaign to destroy his memory. It was survival. To preserve the dynasty, the aberration had to be sacrificed. The emperor, who once paraded as a god, was now reduced to whispers in marble dust. Yet there's a paradox in every Damnatio Memoriae. The harder you try to erase, the deeper the scars you leave behind. Elagabalus didn't vanish. He became a ghost in the margins of Rome's story. Ancient historians couldn't help but record his scandals, some exaggerated, some fabricated, but all fascinating. The more they tried to paint him as a monster, the more unforgettable he became. The emperor, who had once ruled from golden chariots, now ruled the imagination of generations, the cross-dressing emperor, the boy who wanted to be a woman, the priest-king who defied the gods of Rome. Over centuries, the narrative twisted. Medieval chroniclers turned him into a cautionary tale of sin and divine punishment. Renaissance artists depicted him in scenes of orgiastic chaos. Enlightenment thinkers debated whether he was mad, perverse, or simply misunderstood. And in modern times, scholars have asked a more dangerous question. What if the problem wasn't him, but us? What if Elagabalus wasn't a freak, but a visionary? a transgender pioneer, a spiritual reformer ahead of his time. A child caught in the machinery of empire, using beauty and ritual to survive a world built for warriors. The very ambiguity of his story is what keeps him alive. Every broken statue, every scratched-out name, every biased account, all of it points to something powerful, something Rome couldn't destroy, no matter how hard it tried memory. Because to erase someone from history is to admit they mattered, and Elagabalus mattered. Not for his victories, he had none. Not for reforms, most were reversed. But because he forced the most powerful empire on earth to look in the mirror and ask, who do we let rule, and why? In trying to forget him, Rome remembered itself. He was erased, yes, but never forgotten. Was he a depraved lunatic, a divine visionary, or simply a child who never stood a chance? 18 centuries later, Elagabalus still refuses to rest in peace, not in the pages of history, nor in the minds of those who dare to question it. He was killed like a traitor, erased like a heretic, mocked like a clown. And yet the deeper we dig into the ruins of his reign, the more his legacy defies simplicity. Every label, monster, martyr, madman feels like a mask, and none seem to fit. Maybe that's why we can't stop talking about him. The ancient historians had made up their minds. Cassius Dio, the Historia Augusta, and later Roman chroniclers painted Elagabalus as a grotesque joke of an emperor, effeminate, obscene, sacrilegious. Their accounts are dripping with moral judgment, with thinly veiled disgust at his sexuality, his Eastern identity, and his rejection of Roman norms. They didn't just document his fall, they orchestrated his damnation. But even through their venom, traces of a more complex human being shine through a young ruler caught between tradition and transformation, navigating an empire that had no space for who he truly was. Modern historians, by contrast, are torn. Some continue to view him through the lens of decadence, a boy corrupted by absolute power, drunk on ritual and illusion. Others see something far more radical, a proto-trans figure, a queer icon, a spiritual reformer misunderstood by a militarized masculinist society. They point to his insistence on gender fluidity, his rejection of Rome's rigid religious order, and his bold attempt to create an identity not bound by blood law or expectation. Was this delusion or liberation? To ask who Elagabalus was is to ask who gets to write history. Because make no mistake, his story wasn't just about scandal. It was about control. Control over religion, control over gender, control over legacy. And in all three arenas, Elagabalus refused to play by the rules. He made himself a living contradiction, a sun god in human form, a high priest on an imperial throne, a man crowned as Caesar who asked to be called Empress. Rome could tolerate madness. It could even tolerate cruelty. But what it couldn't tolerate, what it feared most, was ambiguity. And maybe that's where his real threat lay. Elagabalus wasn't trying to destroy Rome. He was trying to transform it, not through conquest, but through symbol. He challenged the idea that power must look a certain way, love a certain way, believe a certain way. And for that, he was destroyed. But in his destruction, he became something else, a mirror. A reflection of everything Rome refused to accept about itself, its cultural hybridity, its moral contradictions, its fear of the unknown within. Today, Elagabalus lives on not in marble or memory, but in debate. He is studied in gender theory classrooms, painted in modern art, reimagined in literature and film. Each version tells us more about our world than his. In the 19th century, he was a symbol of moral decay. In the 20th, a warning about excess. But in the 21st century, he is being reclaimed as a symbol of resistance, of identity, of forgotten voices crushed beneath the weight of empire. So was Elagabalus a monster, a martyr, or simply misunderstood? The truth, as always, is messier than the myth. Maybe he was all three. Maybe he was none. But perhaps the better question is this: what does it say about us that we still can't look away? Because history doesn't remember who conformed. It remembers who dared to be different and paid the price. And Elagabalus was nothing if not different. Absolute power doesn't protect you from destruction, it just delays it. That's the brutal lesson we take from the short, dazzling, and catastrophic reign of Elagabalus. For all his crowns, rituals, and imperial titles, he died not as a god, but as a teenager whose empire gave up on him. And centuries later, his story is more than just a scandal to whisper about. It's a mirror reflecting timeless truths about leadership identity and the price of living outside the lines. Elagabalus was not brought down by a foreign enemy. He wasn't felled by famine, rebellion, or even war. He was overthrown by the very system that created him, by generals, senators, and his own family. Why? Because he made one fatal mistake. He ruled without understanding the world he governed. He believed that if he wore the crown, he could remake the empire in his image. That if he believed hard enough in his God, his beauty, his identity, the rest of Rome would follow. But power in Rome didn't work like that. And truthfully, it still doesn't. This is the first lesson: power without connection is just performance. Elagabalus lost the army because he never marched with them. He lost the Senate because he never listened to them. He lost the people because he confused spectacle with service. He ruled from a place of passion, but not of partnership. And in a system built on cooperation, whether imperial Rome or modern democracy, that's a death sentence. The second lesson is even more painful and far more personal. Identity, when misunderstood, becomes isolation. Elagabalus lived in a time and place that had no vocabulary for who he was. He may have been transgender, queer, spiritually fluid, or simply different. We'll never know for sure. But we do know this: he expressed his identity boldly, publicly, and unapologetically in a society that saw difference as danger. And that courage, or perhaps that desperation, came at a cost. Because when identity becomes threat, empathy dies. And when empathy dies, execution follows. It's a pattern we still see today, in politics, in culture, in everyday life. The person who doesn't fit the mold is often not just rejected, but vilified, erased, silenced. Elagabalus didn't just wear the wrong clothes or worship the wrong god, he forced an empire to confront its own narrowness. And for that, he was discarded. But here's the twist. The empire erased him, but history brought him back. Why? Because difference is unforgettable. Rome buried him in a river and struck his name from monuments, yet 2,000 years later, we're still telling his story. And in that, there is hope. Because stories once told can't be untold, and stories that challenge power, those are the ones that survive the longest. So what can we learn from Elagabalus that still matters today? If you lead, don't lead from above, lead among. Power isn't inherited. It's sustained by connection, trust, and humility. If you're different, don't shrink. But also know that boldness must be paired with strategy. Truth without timing is martyrdom. And if you judge, stop and ask yourself, are you resisting what's wrong or what's unfamiliar? Elagabalus didn't survive Rome. But perhaps that's not the point. Perhaps his life, wild, flawed, radiant, was never meant to fit inside the empire. Perhaps his greatest legacy isn't what he ruled, but what he revealed: that power without empathy crumbles, and identity without safety becomes tragedy. And for a modern world still wrestling with inclusion, visibility, and power, that might be the most Roman lesson of all. Not every crown is worth wearing. Not every truth is safe to speak. But the ones who dare to speak it, we remember them. Always. If this story challenged what you thought you knew about history, imagine what else they've tried to erase. Drop a comment. Was Elagabalus a monster, a martyr, or just misunderstood? I want to hear your take. Don't forget to hit the save button so you can revisit this forgotten chapter. And if you crave more untold, uncomfortable, and unforgettable stories from the past, subscribe now. We're just getting started because history isn't dead. It's just been buried.